Wicked. Yes, it does. Hey! I've never been so glad to have intro music. Hi everybody, thanks for coming along. I'm Angie McKeown. Today we're going to be talking about Windows forensics, and I'm going to cover an overview of how forensic investigations can start out, some key areas to look at. I'll touch very briefly on anti-forensics, and then finally I'll give a couple of ideas for next steps. First of all, I've got to talk about me. I now work in the Microsoft Cloud SOC. So that is a group of teams that receive alerts or reports of suspicious or damaging behavior on Azure or the other clouds, and investigate those and respond to them. I've only been in this role 3 months, though. Previously, I still worked for Microsoft, but it was in product security, so it was all Defenders and Sentinel and things. I have a master's in applied cybersecurity, which I did in 2018 in Queen's in Belfast. And this is where I first kind of came across forensics. There was a little forensics module. My dissertation was Android forensics related. So that was fun. More recently, I passed GCFE, which is a Windows forensic certificate by SANS. And before I got here, I had a whole ton of different jobs. For a while I was a teacher. I made VR games. I ran a bookstore. I had an artisan tea company. I worked for the Dyslexia Association, and I was an app developer. Way back in the 90s, I owned an internet cafe and did network installations. So a lot of different varied stuff. I'm also super keen on community stuff. I'm a massive fan of meetups. I want to say, this slide says I'm currently helping, but I'm now no longer helping to run InfoSec NI because I don't live there anymore. I'm still on the committee for B-Sides Belfast, and my new fun thing is Security Brunch, which is going to be brunch where you talk about security. What's not to love? So look out for the first one of those. But I just really believe that community stuff is the bedrock of industry in terms of accessibility for learning, developing contracts, supporting people through their security careers and as they navigate the industry. And it stops people falling through the cracks. I really believe that if you invest in the community, everyone comes out much stronger. I think it's important for this talk to say what I don't have. I don't have a job where Windows forensics is a big part of my daily job. So this talk is based on the theory I know and some amateur tinkering and what I've learned from the industry just from having a bunch of friends in it. I'm still learning, so this is the journey I'm on so far. I'm also obliged to say I'm not here, although I work at Microsoft, this is hopefully, presumably not a Microsoft slide deck. It's not a Microsoft talk. These opinions are all mine. I'm not actually a private investigator either. This is just a fun slide. I can't help you catch your spouse cheating or whatever. Sorry. Anyway, let's get started. So, forensics is all about recovering data from systems and investigating it to piece together what happened. So that's documents, pictures and multimedia, financial files, internet browsing, email and chat, zipped or encrypted files, and also file artifacts, which are the little pieces of files or temporary files or deleted files. And with Windows forensics, a lot of system events also and settings that your computer records in order to help improve your user experience. And that can also be used to help work out what happened. So let's have an example. I've tried to pick a really old example because I didn't want to get into any political trouble. I don't know what it's like to live here. Anyway, in 2017, in the course of investigating another crime, police discovered that MP Damien Green's work machine contained a vast amount of porn. So it was a big news story at the time. It's not secret or anything. And he denied it, of course. And he said that he shared a password with the staff in work in his office. So it wasn't him, it could have been anyone. And a lot of MPs at the time came out to support him. And in particular, Nadine Dorries said, she tweeted that her staff log into her computer on her desk with her login every day. In fact, so many MPs said something similar that the Information Commissioner's Office got involved to investigate and remind everybody about their data handling obligations under GDPR. But there's a couple of key statements around that time that I want to consider. On the one hand, this editor guy, Stephen Pollard, came out to say he has no idea if Green watched porn or not, but the argument put forward by police that he is guilty just because he was logged in at the time is risible. But is that true? And I saw someone else say at the time, if a forensic examiner said it's true, then it's true. But how do we know? Great question. So, Windows forensics is not a monolith. There are lots of different types of investigation that you can do. So, if you have detected intruders, for example, speed is important. You probably start looking at credentials and logins. You probably don't really care too much about strict preservation of evidence. The goal is to understand quickly what happened and fix it. However, if you're investigating workplace crime, so fraud, stealing company data, you're likely maybe to involve HR or legal in that. And so maybe some evidence preservation is needed, and you'll focus on different logs, more activity logs or logs tracking documents or other kinds of data access. For criminal investigations, there's a need to balance the speed versus the evidence preservation. Like, is it a kidnapping? Which means speed is going to be critical. But if it's a multi-year operation making a case against a drug lord, which is going to need watertight evidence, well, you'll need to focus much, much more on chain of custody and detailed and unbiased documentation and creating an audit trail for reproducibility. And the timeline of events will be key too. So you might look more for contacts and external interactions. So again, the focus is on different logs. And for private investigation, domestic cases, accident reconstruction, for insurance perhaps, things where the results may not end up in court, but they still are used to make decisions. For that, we would really like corroboration and a timeline of events, but we're probably not so concerned about speed or really strict evidence handling. Okay, so regardless of the type of investigation we're doing, some of the first steps are the same. And it is a bit tricky if there's any regulatory involvement. I just want to remind everybody, I don't do this stuff for my day job, especially for law enforcement. There's lots of digital evidence preservation and chain of custody stuff that I can't fully speak to. The first step we would like is triage. You need to prioritize what you need to collect first. And that's based not just on the type of investigation, but also the state you find in the machine in, because you have some things to consider. If it's powered up and it's logged in, you can grab a bunch of detail from memory. So sometimes login credentials or chat conversations, but more importantly these days, this is when you work out if there's encryption on the disk. Because if there is, and you turn it off, you've lost everything. Other volatile data that you can grab from memory is things like current active network connections, any running apps and listening ports, and now is also the time to collect data from cloud services if you're legally authorized to do so. Next, we want to think about image capture. So we try to work out which logs we will look at first that give the greatest return on investment, because there's way too many. So often at the very start, only a partial image is taken at the scene, so the investigation can get started. And when I say at the scene, I don't mean necessarily a police crime scene. This can also be your office fraud scene, wherever the machine happens to be. And there are a few different options for this. So you can have a physical image, which is an exact copy of the bits on the drive, but it takes a lot longer and it costs more to store and manipulate. And if there's encryption, there's a chance it's no use. However, it is the most forensically sound option. A logical image is slightly different. It is the currently accessible contents of the file system. So it's going to miss things like the operating system internals, and it's going to miss any fragments or deleted files in unallocated space. And then finally, we get to processing. Ideally, this is the part I would like to come in at, just to be handed an image to work on, because then you don't have to deal with all that other stressful stuff. So first of all, before we do anything else, we start with a backup. And that's in case our tools accidentally make changes or we mess up. And then once we've got our backup, we run some tools against the image. Now, we use the tools for speed, and also because the raw logs are really mostly in unreadable formats because they're not really for humans. So while you can do manual work on the logs, it's very slow and painful. So you set your tools to work parsing the logs into a nice format that's more understandable. And it's only then that we can really start our analysis of what happened. So, what kind of things can we potentially find? There's kind of too much to cover, so I've just highlighted a few examples on each slide of the things that I thought were interesting. Okay, so the MFT is the master file table, and it is a database of info about every single file on the system. It keeps a log of all files that have changed on the system and what caused the change. And it is in UTC timestamps, so we love it. It records things like file size, the timestamps, like we said, the permissions, so the read, execute, write, modify. And then it links out to the rest of the file content on the hard drive. And the timestamps mean that just with the MFT, we can build a handy timeline. Now, even when a file is deleted from the disk, the record's not actually deleted from the MFT. It just has the flag changed in the MFT so that the computer now knows, hey, you can use this space. But the file data is still in that spot on the hard disk. So, if it hasn't been overwritten already, you can grab it or parts of it. Each file has a header which explains what type of file it is. And so the file carving tools that we use to find these look for that and can recover the file or parts of it. The registry is a database of configuration settings for the hardware and the software and the users in the system. I like to think of it like a big sprawling city. So there's lots and lots of different buildings, in this case called registry hives. And they have lots of different uses. They're certainly not all useful to visit. So it's not like when we do this work, we understand the whole registry. Just like a big city, what we have is a few places that we know really well and that predictably have the things we're looking for. And there are a few key hives that have the kind of information we know we might need for an investigation. And these are the SAM hive. So that has user info. Oh, I'm going one forward. User info, ID numbers, account creation, last login times, last field login times, and also some metadata about any cloud accounts associated. The system hive is all operating system settings and services. The security hive is about authentication and user behavior, file and resource access, and any modification of settings. Software is all about application settings and product keys. And ntuser.dat is good because there's a separate one for every user. And in that, it contains a lot of those user personalization settings and logs. And of course, there's just a lot of general logs through the system. In fact, out of the box, Windows 11 has over 100 different types of log by default. And I know that's scary, but it's not even surveillance, really. It's just things that the machine does to function and settings that the operating system or the apps need in order to keep working that we just happen to be able to use for investigations. For example, when your PC starts, a login prompt pops up for the last user to successfully log in. How does it know who the last user is? How does it know which desktop paper to load for you? Or which Dropbox account to connect? I mean, it's all logged somewhere. And it knows who was the last one to log in because it stores the date time information with that. And the sign-in logs also record failed logins and whether the logins were remote or whether they were at the keyboard, whether they used their Windows account, all that kind of thing. So logs can generally be text or database, and they come in very variable formats. So they can be JSON, Windows event log, CEF, protobuf, lots of different types. And unfortunately, they also have very variable timestamps, and they're not always reliable either. So they are usually storing when things are created, accessed, and modified. But unfortunately, the timestamps can be in UTC, or they can be in system time, or epoch time, or WebKit time. So you have to be really careful with your analysis because of that. And that is because, again, these logs are not there to do forensic investigations. They're there to do whatever the machine needs done. Sometimes they only need to be in local time. We're not going to dwell on this. This is just an example of why you don't want to do the manual work on the stuff yourself. We had this in the masters. They sent us out printouts, and you had to actually go in and do it by hand. It was miserable. But this is an example of the MFT, for example. And what it is all in hexadecimal, but different parts of it show the structure of the next bit. So the bit that starts with OX30 is always going to be the file name. So this whole section is the file name. So you can go in character by character and work out what the file name is. But, using tools is better. And for the next bit is the ID. So you can go through all of the logs like that. Shell bags, for another example, just randomly, if you look at that as a human being, it's difficult to work with and it's difficult to parse. So that's why we use the tools. But it's useful to be able to see it and understand it manually if you needed to, because sometimes your tools are giving you different results and you need to go and check under the hood. Anyway, so that's the places we can find the evidence. Let's look at some of the categories of evidence we might look for. So here are just a few examples of where you could find evidence of file usage. First, we have the OpenSave MRU. So MRU stands for most recently used. And it's just a list. And it lists and tracks files that have been opened or saved via a dialog box. Like when you go to save a file and the system opens up the same location as the previous file you saved, this list is how it knows how to do that. Similarly, we have recent files and Office recent files, MRU. So that tracks your recent files opened. And then when you go to the little drop-down menu and you see your recent files populated, this is how you can quickly reopen what you're working on. And this is where it's stored. So when you use your computer, you can open programs. You can drag their window positions around. You can maximize them and change the size. And if you close them or you shut down your machine, when you open them up again, they'll pop back up in the position they were before. How does your computer remember where to put them? Well, you should know by now, of course, it logs it. And one of those places is called Shellbags. So Shellbags stores details on the folders you've accessed on local or network or removable drives, and it's per user. And it has timestamps for the first and last interaction. And the Shellbags entry persists even after the folder is deleted. And we also have Shimcache, which is a log which helps with backwards compatibility with older versions of Windows. But it can tell us information about whether you opened a folder and viewed the files in it, and whether you launched any files. So, if you compare the date times with the ones from Shellbags, showing what windows were open at the time and what position on the screen they were in, well, now we can tell when the porn was on the screen, and if other things were on the screen at the same time, or maybe within such close timestamps that it was unlikely that the person in the chair changed. We've also got, sorry.
With the Shellbags and Shimcache, does it only log the actual user interaction, or is it open file by another file?
That's a great question. I'm pretty sure it's just the user interaction, but I wouldn't take my word for it. I can check. ThumbsDB and Thumbcache, you may have heard of. So this is the one that stores the little thumbnails of pictures and documents and folders that are used when you open stuff, or even when you just hover over things in the taskbar. So you can take these and you can correlate them with Windows Search DB for the file name and the path and other metadata for that file. And of course, we've got cloud storage. So even when the files in your cloud storage are not synced locally, the metadata usually exists locally. So that's things like file names and timestamps, which can help us to build a picture of the kind of stuff you're accessing and work out if there might be items of interest stored in your Dropbox that we then need to go and get some more permission for. So maybe after all this, you think, well, I'll just keep it on a USB. Well, you'd be out of luck, because USB Store has a list of every USB that's ever been plugged into your machine. When you plug in a USB stick to your computer, it records the make and the serial number and the date time and some other stuff. So when someone's saying, oh, I've never seen that in my life before, mate, that's not mine, we can probably actually tell if it's been in their computer before or not. So anyway, how does any of this help us? First of all, it proves the user interacted with the files and folders. It gives us a timeline for those user interactions. It identifies any network or removable storage locations that we may also need to investigate. And it helps us just identify trends in the kind of things that people are doing. For evidence of application usage, link files. Link files are the little things that allow you to pin things to the taskbar or create shortcuts. But there's a log of them, of course, along with date time information about when it was created and when it was last accessed. So even if you delete the program and you delete the taskbar icon, did you remember to delete the link file? And there's other records specific to the taskbar that include whether the app is in focus on the screen or not. So that helps to corroborate things like whether it was running in the background or whether you were really looking at it. We also have Capability Access Manager for those times when the system pops up and asks you, do you want to let this app access your microphone or your webcam or your location? And that doesn't just store whether you've given the app permission, it also includes the start and stop times for those services. SRUM, I never know how to say this one. This monitors system resource usage, so it stores 30 days of app data per app, including who the user was, and the network bytes sent and received. And Background Activity Monitor stores details about power management and the full path and last execution. So that's quite a lot of stuff that you can see already from somebody using apps or not. And then, of course, the one everybody knows about is prefetch. So that preloads all the files and directories used by the app so that after the first time, all the other times you open it up, it goes much, much faster to load because it already knows what it needs to show you. And it can fetch it in the background. And it stores the app's first execution time. So you can't say, oh, I've never opened that. And it stores the last 8 executions as well, and a count of how many times you've run it. And these are just a few examples. There's loads more. Now, sometimes log data can be altered or deleted. We'll touch on that later. And that's why we also come back to corroborating evidence. You have to find multiple corroborating things to push past that reasonable doubt. So once again, this helps us to prove the user interaction with applications, to timeline the user interaction with applications, and identify trends in their usage. And again, all these things have legitimate system or user functions. We're just fortunate that we can also use them for investigations. Browser activity. Okay, so obviously we all know about cookies and cache and bookmarks. But all the major browsers store data in the user profile to make browsing work better. You will maybe already have come across Session Restore. So of course this stores a list of your past websites and the sites that referred them and your session times so that when you close your browser accidentally, you can still open it back and have all the nice things. We also mostly know about autocomplete data. So autocomplete obviously stores websites and search terms and usernames and form data. And here's a sneaky thing. If you think you'll avoid it by never using autocomplete and you choose don't ask again for this website on the little pop-up, well, how is it going to remember not to ask you again? You've guessed it. It's going to store the website on your choice. So now there's evidence you've been there. The browser may also have a download manager in addition to the system download manager. So that's an extra place where you have to delete things if you were downloading stuff and you wanted to hide it. So we can see all the files that were downloaded in the browser. And we can also tell where the files came from with alternate data streams. So this is a little pointer in the MFT record to additional info. And the additional info can be anything, but everybody has agreed to also use them for zone IDs. And zone IDs are used in lots and lots of places. They're used in browsers, they're used in email, Slack, Teams. And this is the thing that when the Office doc pops up to say, hey, you downloaded this file, are you sure you want to enable editing? This is the thing that how it knows where it came from. And that's an easy way then for investigators to prove where a file came from. And it also includes the URL, unless you're using private browsing. It is also supported in all the forensic tools, so you can easily find things like all the files downloaded last Wednesday. Media history is another one that surprised me. So audio and video, you would expect there to be a log somewhere, but it tracks your last play time, which, fair enough. But did you also know it records your watch duration and the last video position? And then Chrome Network Action Predictor. This one's really interesting and I really hate it. So this is used when you're typing in your browser to search for something, and it tries to make suggestions about what sites you might like to visit as you type. And it tries to get better at it by recording letter by letter what you type, what sites were suggested for each letter, and then how often that's correct. So that's like super for Google to do some, more accurate predictions, not just for you, but for everybody. But it's really interesting to me how granular it is that it's literally recording every single character. So this is a log that's going to show your typed searches. And it does also mean, however, that there are suggested websites in this list that were never actually visited by the user. So once again, this is proving user interaction with the websites and the media. It is identifying frequent words and personal information, and it's identifying the source of where files come from. So, all scary so far. Let's touch briefly on anti-forensics. So anti-forensics is what we call it when a person deliberately does things to try and avoid creating or actually removes evidence of what happened in the system. And that can include things like wiping files or logs. So we already know from the MFT and unallocated space that regular deletion is not going to be enough. But you can use a secure wiper like sdelete or CCleaner that does a more thorough job of overwriting the files in the system. Timestamps are not always fully trustworthy. So, for example, things like if the modified timestamp is before the creation timestamp, that sometimes happens, but all it shows is that the file's been copied from somewhere else. But also tools like timestamp let you change file timestamps, and that can make key files appear outside of the date scope of your investigation. So you're investigating, you're setting the date range that you're looking for, but if the files have been changed to a different one, you're missing them. And so you miss key data, or it casts enough doubt on the integrity that it's no longer evidence. Also changing file headers and extensions to disguise one type of file as another. So if you've ever done any CTFs, this is quite a common CTF thing. And often you have to open up the file and modify it, or you have to change the extension. You can also add a lot of confusion just by doing things across multiple user accounts, because it makes it much harder to join up events. Or just simple things like using the private browser. It doesn't store no data, but it stores very little data. However, there are some mitigations for these. So we might suspect deleted data whenever expected alerts or other things are conspicuously missing. So for this Sherlock Holmes story, there was no incident with the dog in the night time, and that was the clue, because it was expected to bark at strangers and it didn't. So Escalate and CCleaner do rename files, but they do it in a particular pattern, and that might not show you what the files were, but it will show you that there was an intent to conceal something. We can suspect timestamp changes when things don't add up across sources, or the seconds of a file are shown as 0000, and we can use corroborating sources to try and figure out what that used to be. So for both of these problems, you can also try using volume shadow copies. So they're made by Windows Restore Points, and they are like a differential of what's on the drive and what was there before. So you can replay them in the forensic tool and view the disk contents as if it was the old version. So if you've spotted files that have been cleaned or whatever, you can go and look at them, hopefully, in the old version. And the tools are really good. They'll also highlight the changes. You do need to take extra care with timestamp anomalies and timeline logic, but sometimes just paying extra attention helps you identify those. Always check file headers in the tool and examine suspicious file sizes, because files that are unusually big for the file type that they would be, that's an indication that something funny is going on there. And it's also useful to document accounts that are in scope and out of scope. Clearly documenting what's available on the system, even if it's not the main focus of the investigation, makes your report clearer. But it also, if references to those things appear later on, then it's much easier for you to widen the scope as necessary. And, private browsing does leave some little traces, and this changes quite a lot. So it's really good to stay up to date and do some research if you're having to deal with private browsing stuff. But the main thing to bear in mind is for everything, this is why corroboration with multiple sources is so important. So, what are the takeaways? Tools is the first one. There are so many tools, from big software suites that automate and process almost everything, cost an absolute fortune, but add so much speed and integrity to investigations that's what big enterprises are using. But the free tools are surprisingly good. So things like Cape, which is very powerful and customizable for processing and collecting logs. And then Eric Zimmerman's tools, which are all open source. And there's so many of them, like Timeline Explorer, MFT Explorer, and actually even some of the tooling that the DART team, so the DART team is the detection and response team in Microsoft, and they go in when someone's had a breach and try to find out what happened. And obviously it's all very mission critical, everything's on fire. The DART team actually use tools which are built on top of some of Eric Zimmerman's tools. And excitingly, actually in the tools area, it's quite legitimate to write your own. Even if you're fairly new, Windows logs change. And new Windows apps or tools create different logs. And there are lots of niche cases as well. So, for example, maybe there's a new PC VR headset and you have an interest in what it's storing about the user. So you can make a big impact quite easily just by doing your own tooling. Jobs, there are all sorts of forensics jobs, from fraud and e-discovery to incident response to law enforcement. Law enforcement can be a little hard to get into. Security clearance helps a little, but there's quite a strong need for understanding procedures and evidence handling, ACPO guidelines, those kind of things. But my recommendation is forensicsfocus.com. They have tons of job listings, and it's really interesting to just browse through them because that gives you some of the language that you need to go and search other places as well. Tons of learning as well. So a couple of places you can start out if you're interested is dfir.training or The Hitchhiker's Guide. I must put this link somewhere. The Hitchhiker's Guide to DFIR book, which was open sourced from the DFIR community. So that's kind of cool. And it's pay what you want as well. So you can just pay what you afford for that one. People. This is in no way exhaustive. I'm a big believer in learning by osmosis, by keeping the right company. So you can reach out to people or even just follow them on social media, and you start to absorb new knowledge just by listening to them talk, just by reading their posts. These particular ones are focused mostly on the UK because that's where we are. And the mindset. The mindset is one of the most important parts. Your job isn't just to collect all the data, and it's not even just to parse it into a form that makes sense. You have to also contextualize it. You have to present what conclusions can and can't be drawn from it. So it's important to keep in mind sometimes the evidence is going to exonerate the person you're hoping it convicts, and that winning is actually about puzzling out the truth, whatever the truth is. And of course, stay curious, because that's what drives all of this. And I want to say that I think two of the key skills are, firstly, contemporaneous notes. Contemporaneous notes is when you add notes to the investigation as you go, and they're supposed to, in theory, be reproducible by the next person that comes along. I added this recently because I have now worked in a job where contemporaneous notes would be really freaking useful. There's nothing more frustrating than opening an old investigation to try and deal with an issue or a complaint with it, and the notes to be incomplete in a way that means that you either can't reproduce what the investigator found, or because logs don't hang around forever, the logs are gone, and then you have no way of reproducing it. So it's really important to have good note-taking skills. That's a good way to focus. And also to be able to identify key log sources, because this is different all the time. Logs change all the time. Organizations have their own proprietary logs. So if you want to do an identity investigation, having an idea in your head what the right places to look for those logs are is a good thing. So that's a really fundamental thing of having an idea of what the key log sources are. Okay. Thank you for your time. And happy forensicating. Any questions? Hey.
What do you think
This is the highly anticipated question about Microsoft Recall. You'll appreciate that I'm not able to give a full answer to this question, but also genuinely, I have not been involved in the product. I haven't had my hands on the product. Setting aside my personal opinions about that kind of thing, I think that it looks like it's going to be a fantastic resource for forensicators. Yes, but maybe if I'm drunk in the bar later, it'll be different. Honestly, very happy to chat later. Hit me up in the bar. You don't even need to buy me a drink. I'm not drinking. And thank you for coming and listening to me.